The wind that night cut sharper than any blade I'd ever known, a howl rising off the Wyoming plains that seemed intent on peeling the very skin from a man's bones. Snowflakes fell not like gentle whispers of winter but like shards of glass, biting, relentless and endless. I stood in my doorway with a lantern trembling in my hand, staring at a shape that had crumpled against my porch. At first I thought the storm was playing tricks on me, some mirage brought on by hunger and loneliness. But then I saw her, the woman who'd haunted every dream I never dared admit I had, Clara Morgan. The widowed schoolmarm of Paradise Creek. 3 years she had worn her grief like armor. 3 years she had walked with dignity that only deepened the hunger of men who would never deserve her. And now here she was, collapsed on my threshold, snow plastering her auburn hair and her wool dress clinging to her curves with merciless honesty. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as cream, her eyes fluttering with the faintest spark of life. Behind me stretched my empty cabin, as silent and cold as my own heart had been for 15 long years. Ahead of me loomed 3 days of blizzard, a storm fierce enough to bury cattle alive and test the will of every soul foolish enough to challenge it. And there she lay, trembling, desperate, and utterly alone. I had made a sacred promise when I was 17, kneeling beside my dying mother's bed in a cabin much like this one. She had gripped my hand with surprising strength and made me vow I would not waste myself on saloon girls or fleeting lust, that I would wait for a woman worthy of my soul. I swore it, and for 15 years I carried that oath like chains forged from love and grief. But as Clara's brown eyes lifted to mine through the storm, as the wind screamed around us like the voices of the dead, I felt that chain tighten until it cut into my flesh, and I knew in that moment that my life was about to change. Forever. Tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the untamed heart of the American West, because what I'm about to share with you is no mere tale of snow and survival. It is the story of how a man learns that some promises protect you and others if you cling too long will break you. I bent down and lifted Clara into my arms, her body shockingly light, no heavier than a yearling calf. Her head lolled against my shoulder, her hair damp with snow and her breath so shallow I feared the storm had already claimed her. Inside, my cabin offered little warmth, just a single fire burning low, a narrow bed against the wall, and the silence of a man who had spent too many nights listening to nothing but the groan of timber and the endless howl of the wind. But to her, even this meager shelter would feel like salvation. I set her near the fire, stripped her coat from her frozen frame, and draped one of my old flannel shirts over her shoulders. I turned away as she changed, yet my mind betrayed me with images of what I refused to see. For 15 years I had taught myself to avoid such thoughts, to bury them under work and discipline, and yet in that moment the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside me. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper, words trembling with exhaustion. She thanked me, eyes fixed on the flames as though afraid of what she might find in my gaze. I wanted to tell her she owed me nothing, that any man with blood in his veins would do the same. But the truth was harsher. Most men in Paradise Creek would have seen her as an opportunity, not a soul in need of saving. As the wind battered the shutters, I realized the blizzard had trapped us in more ways than one. We would be sealed together in this tiny room for 3 long days, stripped of town's gossip and the safe distance I had always maintained. The virgin rancher, they called me, laughing behind my back. They would never imagine the truth, that it wasn't purity I wore but chains. And Clara, shivering by my fire, might be the one woman capable of breaking them. The storm raged through the night, its voice a constant roar pressing against the walls, reminding us that the outside world had been swallowed whole. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, the crackling fire our only proof that life still pushed back against the cold. Clara sat wrapped in my shirt, her hair loose now, curling as it dried. I tried to busy myself, mending a harness, straightening the table, anything to keep my eyes from drifting back to her. But no chore could silence the weight of her presence. I had lived 32 years with little company beyond cattle and silence. Loneliness had become a second skin, something I wore without complaint. Yet now, with Clara under my roof, that silence felt heavier than ever. I could hear the soft sound of her breathing, the faint clink of her spoon against the tin bowl I'd given her. Each small noise filled the cabin like thunder. I thought of the townsfolk and their cruel whispers. They had never seen the nights I spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if my mother's promise was meant as a shield or a curse. They had never felt the ache of being known only by what you refused, not by the man you were. And Clara, I realized, carried her own burden. Widow, teacher, too beautiful to be trusted. Paradise Creek had judged her long before this storm forced her into my home. When our eyes met across the firelight, something unspoken passed between us. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. Two people who had lived too long behind walls, suddenly finding those walls cracking under the weight of circumstance. The blizzard had stripped us bare, left us with nothing but honesty. And honesty, I feared, was more dangerous than the storm itself. By morning, the storm had thickened into a white wall, erasing horizon, sky, and earth until the world beyond my cabin seemed not to exist at all. I stepped outside only long enough to split wood, the cold biting so deep it felt like knives in my chest. Yet even as I swung the axe, my mind wasn't on the storm, or the cattle I worried might be buried beneath drifts. It was on the woman warming herself by my fire, the woman fate had carried to my doorstep. When I returned, Clara was standing near the window, watching the endless white swirl as though searching for something she'd lost out there. The firelight traced the curve of her cheek, the lines of sorrow and strength that loss had carved into her face. She did not speak at first, but I felt her presence press against me like the weight of a truth I had avoided too long. I wanted to ask her what had driven her into that storm, what desperation had forced her to ride through a night that could kill the strongest man. But I held my tongue. Some stories are not asked for. They are given only when a soul is ready to share. Instead, I busied myself with supper, a thin stew that barely filled the bowls. Yet when she smiled faintly in gratitude, it felt like a feast. We ate in silence, the fire snapping, the storm howling, and in that silence grew an awareness sharper than words. I had always believed desire was a force to be resisted, an enemy waiting to undo me. But here, with Clara across the table, I began to wonder if it could be something else entirely, something sacred, something that did not break a man's honor but revealed it. As I lay awake that night, listening to the wind clawing at the shutters, I realized the blizzard was not our greatest trial. The true danger was what I felt stirring within me, stronger than any storm outside. The second day bled into itself, time marked only by the dim light that seeped through the frost-bitten window and the rhythm of logs burning down to ash. Outside, the snow rose higher, swallowing fence posts and burying the land in silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. Inside, silence took a different shape. Clara moved with quiet grace about the cabin, draping her damp skirts by the fire, folding the shirt I had lent her as though it were something precious instead of a ragged garment worn thin by years of labor. I caught myself watching her more than I should, my chest tightening at the sight of a woman making my cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. I remembered the boy I had been at 17, kneeling beside my mother as she made me promise to guard myself, to wait for a love that honored my soul. That boy had believed the promise would be a shield against pain. But 15 years later, I saw how it had become a wall that kept out not only temptation, but tenderness too. And now, with Clara's presence filling the air, I could feel cracks forming in that wall. There were moments when our eyes met and lingered, when the fire painted her features in golden shadow, when the storm outside seemed less threatening than the quiet heat growing between us. She never spoke of desire, nor did I. Yet there was an honesty in her gaze that unsettled me, as though she could see every lonely night, every restless hour I had endured. And maybe she could, because loneliness recognizes itself. That night, as the wind screamed and the cabin creaked beneath its fury, I lay awake again. Clara's breathing was steady across the room, but I felt her nearness like a hand pressed against my chest. The storm would not last forever, and when it ended, nothing in my life or hers would ever be the same. By the third morning, the storm showed no mercy. Snow pressed against the cabin walls high as a man's chest, and the world beyond was nothing but white fury. Yet it wasn't the storm that unsettled me most, it was the change I felt inside. Clara's presence had filled the emptiness I once wore like armor. Her soft movements, the sound of her voice, the way the firelight seemed to cling to her, it all stirred something I had long denied myself. I tried to keep busy. I chopped wood until my shoulders burned, shoveled paths that the wind swallowed up again within minutes, checked on the stock I knew would not all survive. But when I returned, sweat frozen on my brow, Clara was there by the fire, and the world outside ceased to matter. She spoke gently of her life, years of teaching, the ache of widowhood, the sharp edge of gossip she had endured in Paradise Creek. She didn't ask for pity. She carried her scars with quiet dignity, and hearing her truths, I felt my own secrets claw to the surface. I told her of the promise I had made at 17, of the mother who had asked me to save myself for a love pure enough to last a lifetime. I had never spoken those words aloud, not to friend nor preacher. But in Clara's presence, the weight of silence became unbearable. She listened without judgment, only nodding, her brown eyes steady and knowing. The fire popped, snow hammered the roof, and in that fragile moment of confession I realized the truth. I was no longer the virgin rancher by choice alone. I was a man at war with himself, torn between a vow to the dead and a chance at life with the living. And deep down, I knew battles with the heart are fiercer than any fought with guns. On the second night, the storm masked another sound at first, the crunch of hooves on snow, faint but certain. I was outside splitting kindling when I caught it, carried on the wind like a warning. 3 riders emerged through the blizzard, shapes blurred but steady in their advance. My stomach tightened, for there was only one man in Paradise Creek stubborn enough or foolish enough to ride in weather like this. Ned Carver. Carver owned the Lucky Dollar Saloon and most of the sin that clung to it. He had courted Clara with a persistence that turned ugly when she refused him. Flowers that soured into threats, invitations that became insults. Now seeing his horse approach flanked by 2 hired thugs, I knew trouble had found us. I stepped around the cabin, Winchester in hand, though not yet raised. Carver shouted above the storm, demanding what he claimed was his. He had followed Clara's tracks from the gulch, seen the broken mare, and assumed what the whole town would assume, that the virgin rancher finally took in a woman, and not just any woman, but the widow he wanted for himself. His laugh was as mean as the storm, and his words cut deeper than the cold. He mocked me, spat on Clara's name, called her used, called me a fool chained to a ghost's promise. The fire inside me flared hotter than any hearth. I had lived my life swallowing insult, turning away from mockery, letting the town whisper without reply. But this was different. Clara was under my roof, under my protection. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my rifle steady in my hands, not as a tool, but as a promise of defiance. The snow stung my face as Carver reached for his pistol, and in that frozen instant I knew the boy who made oaths at 17 had vanished. What remained was a man with something to fight for. The storm seemed to hold its breath as steel flashed in the whiteness. I worked the lever of my Winchester in a motion as natural as drawing breath, the click of the chamber loud as thunder. My first shot shattered the night, striking one of Carver's men through the shoulder and spinning him clean from the saddle. The second tore the pistol from the hand of the other, sending him cursing into the snow. Only Carver remained, his pistol half drawn when I put a bullet so close it parted the crown of his hat. His eyes widened, fury collapsing into fear as he realized I was not the man he thought I was. The timid rancher mocked in saloons, chained by promises. No, I was something else entirely. A man who had finally reached his breaking point. The silence after the shots was heavier than the storm itself. Carver backed his horse, snarling threats, but his words meant nothing now. He had come expecting submission and found defiance carved in steel. I told him plain the next bullet would not miss. He turned, retreating into the blizzard, dragging his wounded pride and wounded men with him. When I stepped back inside, the heat of violence still coursing through me, Clara stood by the window. She had seen everything. The fear I expected in her eyes was absent. What I saw instead was something that shook me more than the gunfire had. Desire, bright and fierce, burning through the weariness that sorrow had long ago etched into her face. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice low, trembling not with fear but with emotion too deep to name. And in that moment I understood. Some risks are worth the taking, some battles worth the fight. The storm outside still raged, but the true tempest now lay between us, a force no rifle could quiet. The cabin felt different after Carver rode off into the storm. The air still smelled of gunpowder, sharp and metallic, mingling with the scent of smoke and damp wool. My hands trembled as I set the Winchester aside, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me. For years I had been the quiet one, the man who avoided trouble, who carried his mother's promise like a shield. But out there in the snow I had crossed a line I could never step back over. And strangely, I did not regret it. Clara moved closer, the firelight turning her hair into copper and gold. There was no fear in her gaze, only a tenderness I had not seen in years, maybe ever. She reached out, her fingers brushing against my rough hands, and in that touch I felt a lifetime of silence shatter. She saw me, not the virgin rancher, not the man chained to his mother's dying words, but a man who had chosen to fight, to protect, to claim a life beyond loneliness. The storm outside screamed and clawed at the shutters, but inside another storm built, quieter but far more powerful. Clara leaned her head against my chest, and I held her as though she were the only thing anchoring me to this world. Her voice was soft when she spoke of her loneliness, of the years she had lived half a life, a widow surviving but not truly living. I answered not with words, but with the truth my heart had hidden too long, that she was the woman I had been waiting for, even if I hadn't known it until now. When her lips met mine, the fire in the hearth seemed to roar higher, casting shadows that danced across the walls. It was not a kiss of hesitation or fear, but of surrender, two souls finally unchained. The blizzard could rage for eternity, but in that moment we had found something stronger than the cold, stronger than grief, stronger even than promises whispered on a deathbed. The storm broke by dawn, leaving the world buried in white silence. Sunlight spilled across the land, glinting off snowdrifts like shards of glass, and for the first time in years I felt the cold, not as a burden, but as a kind of baptism. Something had ended in that blizzard, my solitude, my silence, and something new had begun. Clara's hand rested easily in mine, her warmth more powerful than any fire. We spent the morning tending to what the storm had left behind. A fence post snapped, half the hens gone to the cold, the cattle restless and thin, yet the work felt lighter, as if her presence gave each chore meaning. She laughed once when the milk pail tipped and soaked my boots, and that sound carried through the snow like a hymn. It struck me then how fragile joy could be and how fiercely I wanted to protect it. But Paradise Creek would not stay silent for long. Word of Carver's humiliation would spread faster than the storm clouds had. Men like him did not forgive, and gossip would twist our truth into something ugly. I could already see it. The virgin rancher finally broken, the widow branded as a temptress. The same town that had mocked me would mock her tenfold, and hatred often grew sharper than winter's bite. That night Clara and I sat by the fire in quiet. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and whispered that she did not care what the town said. Not anymore. Yet I knew better. Words could wound deeper than bullets, and Carver's vengeance would not stop with slander. For the first time I thought of leaving Paradise Creek altogether. Selling the ranch, abandoning the ghosts that lingered in these hills, finding a new start where no promise chained me and no man hunted her. But choices like that are never simple, and freedom always comes at a cost. The storm had passed, but another, far darker, was on the horizon. By midday, the storm had melted into memory, leaving the world crisp and blinding with sunlight. Clara and I stood side by side at the edge of the property, surveying the aftermath. Snow-draped fences, frozen water troughs, and the tracks of a world trying to reclaim itself. Yet none of it mattered as much as the truth I felt burning through me. I could no longer live in the shadow of a promise made to the dead. Life was fleeting, and love, once found, demanded action. I turned to Clara, her eyes reflecting the brilliance of the snow and a courage I had rarely seen. For 15 years I had waited, I had lived behind walls of honor and restraint, believing my mother's words were the compass of my soul. But now I understood they had not been meant to bind me, but to prepare me. For her. For a love that demanded honesty, passion, and the courage to claim it, even against the world's judgment. We spoke little, because words could not capture the enormity of what had passed. Instead, I took her hands in mine and held her close, feeling the strength in her fingers, the warmth of her presence, the rhythm of a heart that matched mine. The town, Carver, the whispers of gossip, all of it could wait. I would face it with her by my side. That evening, in the cabin that had been our refuge, we shared our first quiet supper together, not as a man and a stranger, not as a rancher and a widow, but as two people who had survived storms both literal and of the heart. When night fell, we lit the hearth brighter than ever before, letting the firelight chase the shadows from the corners of the room. She rested her head on my chest, and I traced the lines of her face with calloused fingers, grateful for the woman who had dared to ride into a blizzard and change everything. By June, Paradise Creek witnessed a wedding unlike any other. Neighbors watched as the virgin rancher married the woman who had shattered his chains, some in admiration, some in disbelief. Carver had long gone, his threats and bitterness buried elsewhere, and the town learned that some storms, no matter how violent, only serve to uncover what is true, Clara whispered against my ear that night. In the cabin that had birthed our love, that life would still bring storms, and I held her closer, knowing that with her I could face anything. The Wyoming sky stretched vast and unbroken beyond our window, a promise of possibility, and for the first time in 32 years, I understood the meaning of freedom, of love, and of a life finally lived fully. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of the American West, because some stories, like storms, are meant to be shared.